Thank you everybody who is tuning in. This is Chat with the Melville Scholars, and I'm going to hand it off to Bob Wallace to begin.
Thank you very much, Jocelyn, and welcome to all of you. The 6 Melville Scholars are in the Melville Society Cultural Project. We've been coming to New Bedford every year for 25 years almost, certainly 20 for our group. And this is the first time we're not there to do the marathon face-to-face and be with the hundreds of people who are there, a lot of them sleeping overnight. So it's really sad that we can't be all in the same face-to-face community, but we're really grateful to all of you for showing up today for our first virtual Chat with the Scholars. Usually we're sitting around in a big circle or more oval seating arrangement in the Waddles Gallery. We've been having about 30 to 40 people for the last 5 years. This is a fairly new development in the history of the marathon. And we usually have 2 per weekend, usually on a Saturday afternoon and Sunday morning. And now we're gonna have 1, and we're really grateful for all of you being here. And it tends to be just an open discussion. We had, I imagine a lot of you heard the talk by Stephen Olson Smith last night, which brought up a lot of great subjects about Melville and the world we're living in today. And of course, we have the novel to talk about. And it's really fun to do these every year because people have different things on their minds every year. And whatever things come up, we usually have varied opinions among the crew. So I want to ask my fellow cultural project people, did any of you have a theme you wanted to start with today before we open it up to general discussion and questioning?
I think it's good to just see what questions you all have. We're up to 50 people now coming in, I imagine, from all around the country. And it's so good to see everyone. And I wish we were in the gallery in New Bedford. It's nice to be sharing this. And this is an opportunity for any questions that you have about Moby Dick, that is questions that are chewing on your consciousness, that put it out there as something that we can collectively gnaw on together and come to some deeper meaning of Melville's art. A couple ways that you can share questions. One is if you go to the bottom of your screen and click on the participants, we're now up to 53. A window will open on your right, and at the bottom of that window, there's a blue hand that says raise hand. And one of the ways you can ask a question is to click the raise hand, and we'll see that you have a question and call on you. Another way is to use the chat function also on the bottom of the main screen. You can open that up and type your question and send it to everyone, and we'll have a register of those questions. I think those are 2 good ways to ask questions. There are other ones too, but this is just an opportunity to explore what's on your mind about Moby Dick as we come together in this wonderful colloquy. So who would like to ask a question or a concern or an insight that they have about the text to get the ball rolling?
You know, it may be hard to see the blue hands because we have so many people there. We have to move. There are 4 different screens where people are looking. So I know Jennifer's trying to monitor the screens and the chat to see how the questions come in, but at least at the beginning, maybe it'd be good to put things on chat.
There is a question on the chat already. So.
Walter North has a question, and it is, what do you all make of veneer theory?
Well, not everyone may have been at the talk last night, but this was a concept that Stephen Olson Smith mentioned. It's a way of describing human progress over time. He was borrowing from Hobbes' Leviathan to describe the veneer, the crust of civilization, which rests lightly over a mass of negative impulses. And he opposed it to a friendliness theory, which is the idea that human progress is defined through social connections. Both of these are borrowed from anthropology and sociology, and he used them to distinguish between Ahab, who seems like somebody who's barely civilized because of the revenge and anger inside of him, as opposed to Queequeg, who goes out into the world and connects with everyone else. So that doesn't say what I think of it. I mean, I think it's really interesting. I'll leave that to my colleagues, but I did want to clarify what this question is addressing.
Maybe Walter, you might share what you made of it, because you must have been at the lecture last night.
Well, the third part was a reference to the in-between character who sort of straddles both worlds in Starbucks. I think it's a difficult concept to accept. I think the anthropological underpinnings are pretty weak when you think about someone like the way that anthropologists treated the South Pacific Islanders, which turns out to be not congruent with actual reality and history as observed by the whaling community, but also about what we know about those communities today. So I'm not sure it's really, as a concept, it's interesting, but I'm not sure it's really constructed on strong foundations.
Thank you. So there are some questions that have come in for there's one from Brian Holman. Brian, do you want to just unmute and share your question?
Sure. Hi, Tim. If you can hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so I read the Moby Dick for the first time last summer and have been reading various commentaries on it. And one of the commentaries that I've read several times is that the book can be read as an allegory for multiple different ideas or concepts. And one of them was the idea that the futility of the ultimate search for truth. No matter how much we figuratively and literally dissect a whale throughout the various chapters, we never get closer to the essence of the whale. And so my question for the group was just sort of feedback on the allegory theory and what are some other themes that people see in the book as I prepare for a second read this year.
Thank you.
Before we move on to the next question, I do just want to mention to the scholars that if anybody does raise their hand in the participant, it will highlight them and pull them to the top of the list. So you won't have to scroll through. You'll automatically see them at the top. But nobody has raised their hand just yet. So you can continue on with how you've been doing it with the chat.
And what Jocelyn's referring to is one of the ways that you can pose a question is opening up the participants chart. Having that open on the side, and on the bottom of that, there's the ability to press a button called Raise Hand, and we'll all know that you have something to share. So about allegory, any Melvillians?
Well, is it really a question of, it's the particular allegory that Brian's asking about, right? That whether we can read Moby Dick as an allegory about the futility of the search for truth. And there is a way in which in the book you never quite arrive at any confidence about what truth is, but that the process itself seems to be valuable. And so I was wondering, when you talk about the futility, if there's a way to think about process as something valuable, even if you never quite arrive at any absolute truth. Because of course, that's what the whole book is. It's just kind of, you could say, obsessive questing. And I always think about that line that the whale has to remain unpainted to the last, as if you can never fully capture the whale in art. And yet that hasn't stopped Ishmael from trying to do it chapter after chapter after chapter. So there's a way in which all the talk of futility is coupled with, nevertheless, constant effort to do just that.
Let me add to what Jennifer says. If you're getting ready to read the novel for the second time, right in the third chapter is the painting in the Spouter Inn, which really previews the whole search for truth, because that painting seems to be chaos bewitched. There's no obvious meaning in it. It almost looks like nonsense at first, but Ishmael keeps looking at it and trying to make sense of it. And eventually he sees what may be the shape of the Leviathan in the center of the picture. Asks all the people around him what they see, and people see different things in it. And he comes up with a final theory of his own, based on his attempt to wrestle with it himself, plus what he's heard from others. So I think that really, those 3 paragraphs at the beginning of chapter 3 really condense the process that Jennifer's summarized just now about what it takes to read through the whole book. So there's never any final answer about the meaning of life, but you can come up with a final theory of your own based with as much information as you can have. And of course, if you want to have the meaning of a whale, you won't get it just by dissecting it. And that's what whalers do. They cut it up and carve it up and sell it. And that's not where the ultimate meaning is unless you're a capitalist.
Thank you, Bob. I think Ralph Dumont, you have a comment maybe on the last 2 questions that have been asked. Would you like to share that? Maybe he's not there. The question was, go ahead, Ralph.
Tim, I'd like to go back to the veneer question that started us out, and throw a little bit of whale meat into that subject. I think about the idea of the crust, which Melville writes about in the Apparition poem, the crust of the earth that hides the soft or volcanic possibilities underneath. And I would just cite an object lesson in the 40th chapter, Midnight Forecastle, where the crew all kind of disintegrates into individual contestants, and it finally breaks down into a fight. And there are examples of racism there, where Dagu is singled out for his black skin and white teeth, and I think the implication of this is when the men on the Pequod are not held in check, are not controlled by the force of Ahab's personality, that, and when they're given an opportunity, they will break into this atomistic set of individuals who, given their druthers, will want to fight among one another. I mean, that's just one example, it seems to me, of the idea of what's behind the veneer. One of the kinds of material that is behind the veneer in this book, but there are examples in other of Melville's works, including the Civil War poems that were mentioned by Steve Olson Smith last night.
Thank you, Chris. Ralph's not able to speak, but he was asking about this veneer theory and about allegory, and asked the question as to suppose the novel opposes the validity of symbolic projection altogether, veneers and allegories. And he asked, what if the whale really only is a whale? Would anybody like to comment on that from any of the 62 of us?
Well, the whale is a whale. I feel like there's a kind of playful, capacious symbolism that Ishmael embraces. And then he talks about animal symbols in literature and the painting chapters, and there are allusions to Coleridge's albatross, things like that. But that feels very different from Ahab's single-minded projection of meaning onto the whale, which is invidious. Some scholars distinguish between symbol and allegory. They associate Ishmael with a symbolism that is that kind of accommodates multiple meanings, and they distinguish that from Ahab's more violent projection of his own single meaning onto the whale, which of course is what fuels the hunt.
I was thinking of that the whale isn't a whale. The whale is just words on the page that we have to fabricate in our own minds. And in that sense, all of fiction is a veneer or an allegory that isn't really real, and that the illusion of literary art points at truth in that way. And I've been thinking about Melville and Solomon and Ecclesiastes and the notion that all is vanity, and that if you do pursue something new, try to discover the truth, that's like pursuing the wind, that it leads to woe and sorrow, which I think is one of the real messages of Moby Dick, that the pursuit leads to the depth of woe. But in that woe, as in Solomon, there is a wisdom. There is a wisdom if only the truth is that you can't pursue the truth, or the pursuing of the truth, the process that Jennifer was talking about, is a truth-seeking process. Maybe we can go to an earlier question. This was a broad question by Jerry Stinson. Do you want to ask it, Jerry?
Sure. This is the first time I've read it, and I'm a little over halfway through, but that's certainly enough to get a sense of how energetic the writing is and how wide-ranging, and how he seems to think, I'm obviously an amateur on this, but he seems to think, should I write about this part or go into detail about that part? Should I make fun of something? Should I change perspective? Sure, why not? In each case, he just does it. And so I haven't read other Melville except for a couple of stories. And I wonder about the earlier stuff he had done. Is it the same? I would imagine it's the same kind of thing, but is it?
Well, I'd love to address that question because my students bring it up all the time. Part of what I'm hearing in your question is something about the comedy of the book, and that was certainly the way his first books registered with readers. They were adventures, they were fun, they had these gothic details that were, scary and sensational. And not all his early books were like that, but Mary Kay can say a lot more about them because she's really an expert on those. But I love your phrase about it being a rollicking good time, because I think if you lose that, and if you lose the sense that there are real, yes, they are projections and fabrications, but they're also, he's writing about real people, real sailors, real animals. And with your other word, wide-ranging and rambling, also says something about the structure of the book and the way that it, just as you said, it wanders, it's spontaneous, it's inventive. And in that sense, I think it's really working against the sort of conventional plots and ideas about what a novel should be. So I think it's great that you're seeing that, and I wish more of my first-time readers did.
Thank you.
And I'll just add that I loved your word rollicking too, and my argument that I've been working with, especially with his earliest books, Taipi and Omu, is that those stories started out as oral stories, and we know that Melville was an amazingly good, rollicking good storyteller. We have evidence from letters that were written to him and accounts, like an account written by Nathaniel Hawthorne's son, about how wonderful a storyteller he was and how powerful. And I think that partly what you're getting in that rollicking feeling is that oral quality. You know, I mean, it starts out, call me Ishmael. You know, he's talking right to you, and it's almost as if you're at a bar and Ishmael sits down next to you and starts telling you this story, and you're totally enthralled. And it certainly is true of his earliest works as well.
And there are 5 books before Moby Dick. Mary Kay was referring to the first 2. And then Melville went off into an even more allegorical work than Moby Dick that doesn't have the ballast of the real world or the real whale in it. And that was called Marty. And he threw himself into it. It's a book as long as Moby Dick is, and wasn't a success because it was an invented world of thought, very much more abstract. And that was not a success in the market. And he came back publishing that in early 1849. And then in the summer of 1849, he wrote 2 books in a few months. Those books are Redburn and White Jacket, much more straightforward accounts of his own travels. One as his first trip as a 19-year-old to Liverpool in the Merchant Marine, Redburn, and then his return from the Pacific on a naval ship, the USS United States, that he turned into a book about the naval travel called White Jacket. All 3 of those written or published in 1849 before he went to London, sold White Jacket, and then came back to work on Moby Dick. So there was a lot going on as fodder in these books that had come up. He had written a book a year, and Moby Dick is the next step that in some ways balances some of the realistic experience, some of the philosophizing that he was in, and also his attempt to write something deep and not just write something for the market, to really throw his genius into a book that possessed himself. I think Ahab's possession is in some ways reflective of Melville's own obsession in what he threw into writing Moby Dick itself, the book, not the whale.
I would just add that I think Moby Dick also reflects that Melville had been reading Shakespeare, had been reading Milton, he'd been reading a lot of British and European classic literature, poetry, nonfiction, and the earlier narratives, especially Omo and Taipei, don't so much reflect his reading, although he was a great reader, and there are lots of examples in those early books of his reading, but they tended to be voyages of discovery kinds of narratives, and he really began as a popular writer, and I just wanted to add the word entertainer to the oral tradition that he was writing out of. That he was very much wanting to be an entertainer early on, and certainly that's been that's a strong element through, at least through Moby Dick, I would say.
So David Villalpando has a question that I think is, and Jennifer, you can jump in on this. What's useful about this is it brings us all back to the New Bedford that we're not in right now. How many of the buildings we hear about in the first few chapters, which take place in New Bedford and Nantucket, are historically accurate, and how many still exist? Great question.
Well, certainly the church still exists. So that Ishmael and Queequeg enter into that church with the cenotaphs on the wall. And of course, that still exists. I don't know about others that are actual buildings that still exist.
Well, it might be pointed out that Melville hadn't even been to Nantucket when he wrote about Nantucket in Moby Dick. He did visit Nantucket later So anything there is hearsay or based on what he would have read in other narratives.
But he mentions the wealthy houses, and I think he mentions the banks. So whether from hearsay or
Yeah.
experience, he's aware of the sort of the social strata of the town.
Yeah.
The National Park Service once had a Melville Trail tour through New Bedford that pointed at possibilities of where Melville was at. And I know, Bob, you did a lot of research on this. What did you discover as far as actual spaces in New Bedford?
Well, the Siemens Bethel is the one obvious one. And there was a black church that Frederick Douglass was a member of on the waterfront that was probably the model for the church in chapter 2. But it doesn't exist anymore, and we're not sure exactly where it was probably on 2nd Street. And Union Street is still the main drag going from the top of the hill down to the water, and that is very likely the street that Ishmael was walking down. So the basic geographical layout corresponds to what Melville experienced himself and where the docks were in relation to the wealthier places to stay. Along Water Street, where the sailors bought clothing and where Ishmael and Pequod walk out in the morning, that kind of corresponds to Water Street at the time, where there were sheep shops for sailors' equipment, stuff like that. So it is anchored somewhat in his physical experience, and it's not in the novel, but Melville himself signed up at the Custom House for his own voyage, and that Custom House is still there 1 block from the Whaling Museum itself. So that building is still the original, and the Siemens Bethel is the original one, but it burned down and went in the 1860s or something and got rebuilt, and the cenotaphs that are on the wall survived the fire and were reinstalled. So that is a reconditioned building on the original site that we can imagine Ishmael and Pequod walking into.
We were noticing when we were there a year ago that where the highway is down by the down where the boats are, that was where a lot of the buildings and haunts that the sailors went to before you started climbing up the hill in New Bedford towards civilization and culture. And of course, Melville would have been there, and all those buildings were destroyed for the highway.
I just want to jump in. There are a few other questions, and I want to make sure I put them out here. One was a question about the relation between Moby Dick and the Civil War. And the other was a question about the possible influence of Darwin's Origin of Species on Melville's later writing, although we could also think about Melville's writings about the voyage of the Beagle, since that ends up being very important for his earlier writings as well. So Civil War and Melville and Moby Dick, as well as Darwin and Melville.
Well, Jennifer, I think you know so much about Darwin and 19th century science. I'd love to hear what you had to say about that.
Well, we tend to go to Darwin's Voyage of the Beagle, because there's an obvious link to the Encantadas, since that is Darwin's writing about the Galapagos. I think also we tend to associate the Voyage of the Beagle with a kind of naturalist sensibility that values wonder, that is interested in seeing continuities between different life forms, and eventually Darwin would see continuities between extinct and modern life forms, and would lead him eventually to his theory of descent with modification and evolutionary change. I think a lot of times when people ask about the literary influence of Darwin's Origin of Species, they're really asking about possible indication in the writing that humans are somehow animalistic, that there has been a decentering of the human, or that human society is marked by kind of barbarism or brutal competition. That's certainly what you see at the end of the 19th century with a lot of literature that's influenced by Darwin's Origin of Species. And often that's not even Darwin, that's social Darwinism, which is often inconsistent with Darwin's ideas about the natural world. Anyway, if you're asking about that, I mean, there's a late poem called, I think, The New Ancient of Days, and it is about the discovery of a fossilized ancient human. It's a very difficult poem. I don't think I've figured out every line of the poem, but it actually is about the kinship between humans and primates, and it's a very kind of scathing and mocking poem, I think, that does kind of dethrone the human. That's really the only place I go when I'm thinking about the origin of species. If I'm thinking about Darwin generally, I want to think about the voyage of the Beagle and the sense in a lot of Melville's writings about the wonder, the enchantment of the natural world, which is certainly there in Darwin. We often assume that Darwin gives us an impoverished sense of the natural world, but in fact, so many of his writings are about its wondrousness and about its grandeur and about how enchanting it is, and also about the affinities between different life forms, which you see in Moby Dick, of course, with Ishmael in the Grand Armada chapter, thinking about the affinities between humans and marine mammals. I'll just pause there.
Art, I see that you have your real hand up
Yeah,
there.
I couldn't find the little blue hand on the screen, but I'm the one who asked that question. And it seemed to me that it might have been somewhat of a realization that we are all of a piece in terms of relationships. And at that time, I don't believe that it was recognized the mammalian nature of whales. I think they were still conceived of as fish. But I'm not sure where that tipping point took place.
Well, you know, one of the extracts is from Georges Cuvier, in which he says that the whale is I can't remember exactly, but a mammiferous creature without hind legs. So the whale, and the sources that Melville consulted in the Penny Cyclopedia definitely classify whales as marine mammals. But you also have a kind of folk taxonomy or a layman's taxonomy that insists on their fish-like
Yeah, and I think among sailors, for example, they may not have bridged that gap because they were still considered a commercial enterprise and fishing in that sense.
It's also worth pointing out that the idea that there are affinities between, let's just say, different mammals is very well established when Melville is writing. We have yet to get to the point where those affinities are seen to be a reflection of a shared evolutionary genealogy. So there's all sorts of speculation about why, if you examine the skeletal structures of different mammals, there are these striking resemblances, that the structure of a bat's wing and the structure of a whale's flipper and the structure of a human hand all look very similar when you go beneath the skin.
Comparative anatomy was just evolving at that.
Yeah. So Richard Owen, who's a famous anatomist, you know, he did these studies where he talked about the anatomical similarities, but he did not attribute those to a shared genealogy. Right. He believed in the fixity of species. He said that they were a reflection of a shared divine archetype. So there's a way in which those affinities are understood to be metaphysical. And what Darwin does is explain how they are in fact physical. They are those resemblances are the bodily vestiges of our ancestry.
That's a great insight. Yeah, thank you.
So the question about the Civil War, and it's referred to again in the question that Sean and Stacy asked about the politics of the time. comparing the time that Moby Dick was written with politics today. But if we stay in 1850, when this book was written, obviously the Civil War hadn't happened yet. But it is clear that on the horizon is the doom of the Pequod, which Harvard professor Alan Heimart saw it as the ship of state and saw Ahab as someone like John C. Calhoun, who might be acting in an interest that overwhelms the benefit of the whole. But I think crucially, what occurs during the writing of Moby Dick is that when California is added as a state, it creates the Compromise of 1850. And the compromise to add in California as a free state was the passage of the Fugitive Slave Act, which required individuals such as Melville's father-in-law, who was the Chief Justice of Massachusetts, to return runaway, fugitive, enslaved people to their owners in the South, to put the federal law behind that return. And that did set off all kinds of fury through the decade of the 1850s that would culminate in Lincoln's election and the Civil War. So, but the strife, I think, of the time is there in the book. We can't read it as referring directly to the Civil War because that would be anachronistic. But the events that are happening in 1850 are the political events that would culminate a decade later in secession. And Calhoun's nullification and the rejection and the idea, should the Constitution be more important than rights and unity? These were issues that, in some ways, were played out in the politics on board the Pequod.
I can add briefly to that. I was going to bring up the Fugitive Slave Law because it was passed in September of 1850. And that's right when Melville moved from New York City to Pittsfield and finished the book on the farm. And letters had suggested that he thought he'd be done with the book in the fall. And he obviously expanded the book and took it in a new direction in the fall when he moved to Pittsfield. And when he was living in New York, earlier that year in May of 1850, Garrison's American Anti-Slavery Association had their annual meeting in New York every May for 5 or 6 years. And that year, the authorities allowed the mob to take over. And the mob ran in and tried to shut down the opening ceremonies in Broadway Tabernacle. And Douglas helped to stand them down. He faced off with the mob leader and quieted the day. But the next day, the meeting was actually in the Melville's library, the Melville Society, the New York Society Library, right next to the Tabernacle on Broadway, where Melville was writing his books because the house was very full. And on that Saturday, the city let the mob overrun the library and run Garrison out of town. And they could not come back for another 3 years to New York City. And it was a week later than that Douglas and 2 English women were walking on the Battery and got attacked by a mob. So this was an incredible civil disruption. Certainly to anyone in New York, it felt like what happened in DC this week, where things got overrun in a way you wouldn't expect. And it was, 4 months later that Fugitive Slave Law was passed. And there had been an earlier law from 1793 where Judge Shaw had already sent fugitives back. When it came to Judge's Court in Boston, he felt he had to send George Latimer back in 43, which was a big deal. But the 1850 law was so much more tighter and really made every person in the North responsible for sending a slave back if they knew about it. So I think that riot in New York and in the library Melville was working in, followed 4 months later by the Fugitive Slave Law. really did set an inevitable framework within which Melville was working. And I think it certainly covered the, influenced the flavor of the book as it developed.
I know there's more to say on that, but while we're following up that question, we have about 20 minutes left. So I want to encourage you to go to the chat and ask your questions so that we have a series of other maps to follow as we explore these issues. I know you've got a question on your mind. Throw it out there, and it may be something that we can collectively investigate.
Tim, there are two questions, and Bob, in a way, has started to address them, but they're both about relating the book to contemporary politics. And someone has mentioned loomings in the grand contested election for the presidency, which of course was very resonant for readers in 2001, as we might remember. But that question comes from a UK reader.
Would that reader like to elaborate on the question?
Or I guess that might be Sean or Stacy, indicating what relevance you see of Moby Dick in today's politics, or Andrew reading his interpretation of the grand contested election.
So I was late to the Moby Dick party and didn't read it until I was about 40 something. And then I had the opportunity to study with you all in New Bedford. And you really opened my eyes to everything that I was missing in all of the political cartoons. It seems that every few weeks or months, there's another meme or a high level cartoon from the New Yorker thrown out there, comparing Moby Dick to the political, in a political satire. Did I do okay?
That's a great point. And I think the political parallels are many and unavoidable. So if there's a silence here, I think it's because it's filled with so many relationships and questions inspired by your comment. I'll just leave it at that.
And even people who have not read Moby Dick know that there's an obsessive quest for this white whale, and that's the meme that gets put into all these different cartoons. And who's the whale and who's the Ahab can be on either side of a political argument. And it's very fascinating to line up who's been put in those different guises. But of course, remember that's a shorthand for Moby Dick, and it doesn't bring Ishmael's encompassing a meditation into the equation, who ultimately is the survivor, along with the whale itself, of this text. I think in some ways reducing Moby Dick to that obsessive quest, and this says something about contemporary politics, evades the complexity and richness of mediations and meditations that are necessary to survive those threats to democracy. And that's what Ishmael represents. And that's what the book stands for in some ways, is Ishmael's ability to not only survive the Pequod and Ahab's tyranny, but to survive his own trauma of having experienced it and be able to tell the story again and free himself from that thraldom. When that book is over and Melville writes it for the second time, Ishmael is free from that tyranny, and there is a freedom. Melville sensed that he had written a blasphemous book and had a real sense of irresponsibility for doing so. That there was a freedom. So those are some thoughts.
Although he did say afterward that Moby, that he had heard of krakens. He had heard of a bigger fish in the sea, and he was going to write about that. So I just would push back a little bit on the idea that he was free. I think the fact that I think he was haunted, and that's what pushes him back to write the book. If he gets free, I mean, if he gets free at all, it's because he wrote the book. Taking Ishmael as the author, of course, but.
And that is a great comment, Chris. And I would just say that Melville's freedom is that no matter what anguish he's going through at different phases of his life, he still freely takes the pen to express that condition. And the freedom of his own writing is the mode of that liberation. If he didn't do that, and it's a lesson to all of us that that whatever dilemma we're going through at any moment in our life, Melville wrote his life into being, and that's why we're connected with him, because we can be intimate with someone who went through this and is dead and white and gone long ago, but the intensity of his own involvement with his experience was manifest in that art and communicates a vitality to us as readers, a freedom to escape the age that he lived in that didn't understand what he was doing.
Can I jump in with some more questions? Because we have a few of them. One is there any risk that Melville will be canceled in the Academy?
Interesting question.
Well, I'd like to put that together with the question as well about the book being hilarious and the risk of analyzing it so much that you lose the vitality of the book. The question about being canceled or misread is a prevailing one. I think the book has been canceled and misread many times already, and that it will continue to be as long as it has an impact on people. But there's a larger question about perhaps the value or danger of a cancel culture. And I would just want to introduce at this point a question that came up while we were preparing for the marathon, which was that some of the readers were concerned about some of the language in the book, especially associated with Black characters like Fleece, particularly Fleece, but also Pip. And so the museum posted a disclaimer to say that this was an issue in the reading experience. So I just wanted to ask the group really what you thought about that, and whether it's related to canceling in the sense that readers could cancel the book because of its racist language. But I think that's a very simple way to express a larger question about what are the limits of the reading experience of the novel? Are there points at which you just put it down and say, I can't read anymore? So I'd be interested to know if anybody noticed that message about the language and responded to it for in whatever way.
I don't think we've gotten to that chapter yet, Wynn.
No, I know. But no, Tim, it was put with the whole. The minute you open it up, that message is there. It starts at the beginning of the of every single video now. So it's not just with certain chapters where language appears that could be considered offensive.
We also placed it before chapter 10, before I think chapter 48, I want to say 64, and I also think
Oh, you did?
100
Okay.
or 110. Yeah, we also placed
Okay.
it throughout just in case, people didn't get to see it in the beginning. We wanted to make sure that it was there, not only for those readers that were reading those passages, but also for any audience member that was just now watching from one point on.
I think that it's an issue that's very much in the forefront of contemporary reading as we look back on what we consider classics and have to wrestle with this. I mean, I think it's a question that can't be answered really definitively right now. The question has to be asked, at what point do you put down the book? And I think that varies from one reader to another, whether it's the anti-Semitism that you find in Hemingway or Edith Wharton, or racism in F. Scott Fitzgerald, that I think in fact is far more blatant than anything in Moby Dick. And so I find Moby Dick tolerable that way, and I can make allowances for Melville, and I think he was very far ahead of his time. In fact, I think I think his scorn was for humanity in general, and not for just a particular race. But it's a question that cannot be answered definitively, but in large, I think.
Right, there's a couple questions. I think the danger is that that readers will cancel Moby Dick by not allowing Melville to educate us by reading it with him. If there were deep readers of Moby Dick, he would have received a lot more pushback in his own time, in some ways. So I want to go to these questions that might relate. David's question okay, so there's a question, Mary Kay, maybe you can address this, by Mike Starnes. At the end of the book, why were there harpooners on the mastheads? Testigo hammers the bird to the mainmast. Would harpooners ever have taken shifts aloft? Why do you think Testigo was where he was in the final moments of the Pequod's voyage? And that's relevant to David's question that talks about the whaling and taxonomical ballast in the book. And he's asking, is this materialist language in the voice of Melville or Ishmael?
Yeah, Mike, thank you for that question. You're right. Generally, the harpooneers, or they would often be called the boat steerers, would not be aloft in the mastheads. That would be a position for ordinary sailors. I've always just thought of them being up there because at the end of the book, because those are the people that Ahab trusts the most to cite Moby Dick. He has this faith in them that they will cite the whale and he has some questions about, he has a lot of questions about Starbuck, but I feel like he doesn't completely trust the crew to be as vigilant as he somehow thinks the pagan harpooneers will be. And that question about the materialism, I mean, I've always loved that. I mean, as somebody who spent over 40 years climbing around on the only whale ship that's left in the world, which is the Charles W. Morgan at Mystic Seaport Museum, I have always loved the fact that Moby Dick has this sort of kinesthetic, materialistic underpinning to the story, and that I always argue that Melville not only knew whaling, he had moral questions about it and aesthetic questions and linguistic, all those different things, but he also knew whaling kinesthetically, and that sort of kinesthetic understanding underlies the book, is something that I've long argued.
Do you see that, Mary Kay, as being in Melville's or Ishmael's voice, or how might you distinguish between them?
That's an interesting question. Yeah, I kind of see it in both their voices. The Ishmael who's telling us the story is an older Ishmael who has spent not only the time on the Acushnet at sea, but years after that at sea, as we kind of gather from what he tells when he tells the town host story, which is told in the older Ishmael's voice. I think it's both their voices. I mean, there's just things like there's a moment where they bang with the bars on the forecastle and the men sort of exhale up and they go and quickly take the sails down, or and Melville doesn't even give us a lot of details about it, because they're just this sense of them as sailors and seafarers. The way he describes it, it's almost elliptical, because he understood so much about whaling, and so does Ishmael. So, yeah.
Barbara Schneider has a wonderful comment about the whiteness of the whale, speaking to the great complexity in the human experience and about racism without being racist. And I think that is the spirit in which to look at how Melville explores uh, the fancied superiority that we invent for different peoples and different ranks. Leslie, you have a question. Would you pose it yourself?
Sure. Just getting back to the question about the search for truth, there's a passage, and I can't quote it verbatim, about how there's no final harbor. We never reach that final harbor. Life isn't a series of steady progressions. We circle around and around. And I guess I wonder how that ties into the search for truth. If there's no final resting spot, what he's saying about that we can never come to any kind of resting place. And that seems to tie into the search for truth, but I'm not exactly sure how. But it's something about how life is about a journey and life is about a series of experiences, but they don't necessarily add up to something that we could call truth or final resting place.
I think the quotation that Ron Ron, would you read that quotation? Because that's an answer to this question in some ways, if there is an answer. Leslie, I think your point is that, that this is a problem. Can you read your quote, Ron? Maybe he's not connected in. Would anybody like to read that that wonderful quote from Moby Dick?
I think I just.
Please. Oh, there he is. Go ahead, Ron. Good to see you.
Nice to see you as well. Would to God these blessed calms would last, but the mingling threads of life are woven by warp and woof. Calms crossed by storms, a storm for every calm. There is no steady, unretracing progress in this life. We do not advance through fixed gradations, and at the last one pause. Through infancy's unconscious spell, boyhood's thoughtless faith, adolescence doubt, the common doom, then skepticism, then disbelief, resting at last in manhood's pondering repose of if. But once gone through, we trace them round again, and our infants, boys, and men, and ifs eternally.
Could I add one thing? Thank you for finding that, Ron. This actually brings us back to Melville and Darwin, but I think it really speaks to this question about the search for truth, and that Melville in the mid 1870s wrote the longest poem by an American called Clarel in a pilgrimage. And this refers to a pilgrimage that Melville himself had made through the Holy Land. And it is a long poem, 18,000 lines of iambic tetrameter, in which he posits the kind of religious pilgrimage that was common in the period after Darwin. So he continued to wrestle with the question of truth, with the question of knowledge that interrupts or counteracts, counters accepted wisdom, as Darwin's Origin of Species had done for a whole culture. Clarel is just an object lesson of Melville continuing his own search in the period after the Civil War through the early years of the 1870s, and of his own struggle to come to an understanding of the nature of the truth. I think it's instructive that he also intended to publish this in 1876 at the centennial of the United States, as if to kind of assess the state of things in the United States at the time, kind of implicitly anyway. Hope I didn't rob a further comment from you, Ron.
Although I would love to hear Ron riff on if.
Yeah.
That would be delightful. But I think this may be Jocelyn's giving us an indication about moving back to the reading. And the notion of ifs eternally is a wonderful, wonderful way to end our exploration today. That again, to encourage us to keep up the question if, and what does it imply? If implies that it might not have been as well, which is a very profound thinking. There's a lot of other questions, but I don't want you all to stay on if you came on board for an hour. But if there's another question, we could explore it. It's fun to be with you all. It's amazing to see. We would be one big circle if the 62 of us was around, sitting there on chairs underneath the paintings in the gallery, and it's wonderful to see that circle getting bigger each year, and to see so many of you here that are often there around as we explore it. But we just can't walk back upstairs and hear the book now in the same way. We have to switch channels.
I do want to mention before, if you are continuing, that those of you who might not be monitoring the chat, I just posted that if you are navigating back to the marathon, you may notice that it will bring you to the beginning of the video. You can utilize a timetable available on our website to approximately find where we are in the book, or you have the leisure to fast forward to where you left off and watch from there. If you would like to follow along in real time, we are currently on the reading of chapter 17. To get to that chapter, you will then manually fast forward on the video and watch from there. We do have time for another question or so, but then we will have to wrap up shortly.
Any questions? There was one, the symbolism of the doubloon. Joe, what does the doubloon going down with the ship and the symbolism of that mean? She's suggesting, is it a comment on capitalism? Anybody like to take that up?
Well, it's a symbol of many things. It's a mirror. In the doubloon chapter, it's a mirror where we see several people on the Pequod come forward and kind of offer their own individual reading of it. Ahab, perhaps most of all, where he sees his own mightiness and power, and like the mountain and the tower, what it was, Flask, who sees 960 cigars that he could purchase with that. So it is an image of capitalism, but it is, I think, like a mirror. I think it's also an image, one of many images in the book of the sun. And by the end of Ishmael's narrative, he finally rejects the fire, the light of the fire of the try-works, and encourages the reader to believe only in the sun. It's the only true lamp, the light of day. I might say knowledge, science, what can be learned through the eye, rather than through other other means of preoccupations and obsessions of like Ahab's. But it is a really fascinating symbol. And it is, I think, one of those symbols that can work in many, many ways. It can be almost anything we want to make it, because there are so many possibilities.
The doubloon goes to the crew member who sees Moby Dick first, and Ahab claims that privilege, and then the doubloon goes to the bottom of the ocean and is there as treasure for anyone in the future like us who might dive to be able to find it. But I think it indicates how Melville himself was not rewarded economically for his art by writing Moby Dick. And I think that it does take the text out of the economic range and challenge us to value it with our own meaning, to value the book itself and the whale itself with our own meaning. I think I want to thank you all. It's so delightful to be with you all today, and I hope next January we can be together in a real circle, healthy, and the museum has been so gracious in making the transition of this reading to the virtual realm, and I'm just so happy that so many of us are still able to connect through this means.
Here, here.
See you all next year.
Thank you all so much. I think there were at least 63 participants at one point, and many people I can see by the videos have more than one person. So I think we had an amazing turnout. So thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. It's wonderful to be here. Enjoy the rest of the book.